Okay, good evening. Welcome to our webinar this evening. As folks come in, Bob Strauss will be presenting how to choose and buy the right franchise. He's a certified mentor with SCORE North, Cook, and Lake counties for several years. I'm Al Blitz, one of over 70 mentors with our chapter, with our SCORE chapter, and I'll be serving as our moderator this evening. This webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our chapter YouTube channel. In about a week, you can visit YouTube and go into the search SCORE North, Cook, and Lake counties, and you should be able to find the replay. Please submit your questions during the webinar. We're going to have a Q&A at the end for about the last 15 minutes or so. So we very much look forward to seeing your questions either in the Q&A or chat function. And again, 45 minutes for the presentation and plenty of time for questions. Bob, could you move us forward? I can thank our friend Lev Callums from the Arlington Heights Memorial Library for serving as a co-sponsor this evening. And it's always a pleasure to work with the library and your team. Lev, want to share a few words of some of the programming going on?
Definitely. Hi, thank you everybody for joining us this evening. My name is Lev Kalmans. I'm an info librarian over at the Arlington Heights Memorial Library. And I, along with my colleague Diane Malik, plan programs for our small business and entrepreneurial community. Two programs of note that I want to mention coming up in June. One is on June 8th, and this is our bi-monthly, every other month, our small business coffee and connect networking program. So it's we do a in-person small business community networking event every other month. We hosted our first one in April. Just people gather, meet each other. So it's a great time if you're a small business owner, if you want to meet other small business owners in the area. Once again, it's going to be on Wednesday, June 8th at 9 a.m. and we do serve coffee and donuts if that's an incentive for you to come. And also another program on Tuesday. So this is a virtual program on Tuesday, June 14th. It's an introduction to a new resource that we have over at the library called Legal GPS. It's basically a software designed for small business owners to kind of figure out what sort of legal assistance they may need or how to set up their business from a legal standpoint. So it's like if you think of TurboTax for taxes, Legal GPS is for kind of figuring out your how to set up your business from a legal standpoint. So we will have the one of the founders of this resource talking about how to use it and how you can benefit, how small business owners can benefit from using it. So that's it. That's what we have coming up coming up in June.
Thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to collaborate with you and the library and other staff members. You bring tremendous value to the business community in your community, and we really greatly appreciate your collaboration with SCORE. I'm going to convert you now to being a viewer. So thank you again, and you should be able to view the webinar and we will follow up later. Take care. Thank you. Okay, Bob, let's continue a few more introductory housekeeping slides so we can get to the real purpose of this evening's program, which is Bob Strauss. A little bit about SCORE, if you're not familiar with us. We are a not-for-profit funded by the Small Business Administration. And we have over 11,000 volunteers like Bob and myself across the country, 300 SCORE chapters. And we are very proud of the fact that this organization has been in business, so to speak, since 1964. Bob, another slide, please. Yep. Thank you. Most importantly, SCORE offers free and confidential mentoring. You can go to the northchicago.score.org website and just request a mentor. Also, when you get time, visit score.org, our national website. It has tremendous resources, business tools, templates, on-demand webinars. It's really a tremendous portal to business resources for new business development and for existing businesses. Okay, Bob, I think I have two more and then we go to you. Okay, two upcoming webinars, Cybersecurity 101 for Small Business, and very informative webinar, excuse me, and Harness the Power of Social Media to Grow Your Business. Two very different topics, but extremely relevant in today's environment. We hope you can join us. We'll be sending out announcements for these webinars, and you should receive them as registrants for this evening's webinar. Okay, Bob, I think we're on our final slide, and we're going to make it easy. If you'd like to request a SCORE mentor, use the QR code with your smartphone, and it should take you to the registration page, and it'll make it really easy to request a mentor for free and confidential mentoring services. And we're ready for Bob Strauss. Oh, and let's have Bob introduce yourself and your considerable expertise in the franchise world. And I will join you at the Q&A at the end. And again, please send your questions in. We want to have a really active Q&A session with Bob. Okay, Bob, it's all yours.
Thanks, Al, and thanks, Lev, as well, our friends at the Arlington Heights Library. We appreciate the opportunity to talk about something I'm very passionate about, which is franchising. Franchising made my life something I might not have envisioned, and so I'd love to talk about it. I may have a fairly unique perspective to share because I was both an employee of 7-Eleven. I worked when 7-Eleven was entering the Chicagoland area as a consultant to the store franchisees in the Chicago northern Illinois area. I helped them operate franchise businesses. I helped open new franchise locations. I represented the interests of the franchisor. Franchisor is the parent company that sells the franchise locations to individuals who are the franchisees. I then, at a certain point, decided instead of being a consultant to a group of stores, I would franchise and eventually scale and own my own group of stores. And so I pivoted and became a franchisee. I opened one store and soon grew beyond that. Had a wonderful 40-year run as a franchisee. So I both wore the hat of being a franchisor, wore the hat of being a franchisee, enjoyed doing both, understand and have empathy for both. But then as a franchisee, I realized that the individual stores, the store owners, needed in some way to come together, not as a union, but to come together to advocate for issues that may have been of importance to them. It may have been insurance, to be able to work as a group to get better rates. It may have been legislative matters. Speaking of which, I became very involved in as an advocate for fair franchise protection laws, which at this point, a majority of the states have fair franchise protection laws. When I first franchised, almost no states did. I became involved in establishing franchisee operated trade associations, not just 7-Eleven, but working with franchise groups from throughout the country. Became very familiar with their issues as well and their systems. And we came together again for the same reason that as individual 7-Eleven franchisees came together. There were things that as a group we had common interests, and by working together, we could leverage our voices, which meant then Bob Strauss had to start buying some more proper clothing to start visiting, making visits to Washington, D.C., making visits to Springfield. Became involved. I was voted on to White House Small Business Council. I met with some of our state senators, congressmen, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. The FTC, by the way, oversees franchise systems in the U.S. And I was also voted on as the first franchisee to be a representative on the Illinois Attorney General Franchise Advisory Board. I can tell you that that was back a few years ago. At the time, my hair was a bit darker. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the pros and cons of franchising. And, before we go any further on the agenda, I want to back up and share a little story. I remember when I worked as for 7-Eleven, when I was an employee of the franchisor, and the story went something like this. There was this fellow who was interested, his name was Tom, and Tom was interested in buying a franchise. And so anyway, Tom reached out to a representative of a franchisor. And anyway, the franchisor said, asked Tom, well, why are you interested in buying a franchise, Tom? And Tom said, well, I worry a lot. I worry about my job security. I worry about money. And I want to stop worrying. And Tom said, ask the franchisor, anyway, how much money can I make if I buy a franchise? And the franchise representative said, well, if you do a really good job, you might make $1 million. Tom said, $1 million? Really? From that little franchise business, $1 million? How can I do that? The franchisor said, well, Tom, that's your first worry. So anyway, there are definite pros to franchising and there are cons to franchising. We're going to cover those. We're going to discuss what you should expect from a franchisor. We're going to talk about the steps in selecting a franchise. We're going to talk about a lot of the various franchise models that are out there, things to consider, and where do you go? A lot of us know how to Google and find information for other things that we do every day of our life. But if we're not used to doing deep dives into researching franchises, we're gonna share some tips on gathering that information and then ultimately making that decision. So everyone has some common elements in their situation, but but we all have some things that are different. So think about yourself. You may be thinking about buying a franchise, which may be why you joined in this evening, and we hope that we're able to assist you if you're thinking about buying a franchise. Some of you, do you work for yourself? Some of you may not, or are you currently working for someone else, or are you not working and you're just looking for a business? And like Tom, are you worried about your job security? When I got out of school, most people thought you signed on for a job for life, never knowing that there wasn't a guaranteed job for life in the future in all cases. And what are you looking for a business? So let's talk about what a franchise is. So sometimes it can be confusing. You can say, well, Chicago Cubs, isn't that a baseball? The Bears, is that a football franchise? Well, yes, but we're going to talk about in more the pure terms the businesses that generally have that moniker attached to them. So it's a way of doing business. Generally, there's developed names and trademarks, recognized trademarks that you are allowed to use as part of buying a franchise. And it should be products that are available, services, could be e-commerce systems, it could be business systems, and you receive that and other things in return for paying an initial franchise fee and ongoing fees that are generally called royalties. So let's first take a look at some of the pros of a franchise system. You would expect that the system, there's experience, that you have a management team who's been there, understands how to do it, and in turn they can share that information and bring you up from 0 to 60 with a very sleek training system. Many franchise systems continue to support for the life of the franchise contract, continue to provide sometimes required training. Sometimes the training has to be paid for, every time you go or send someone to additional training, even if it's computer-based training. You anticipate ongoing support. Some franchisors provide people like I did with 7-Eleven that routinely visit the business, review the performance data, and help people understand to develop a method to move forward to whatever goals they've set for themselves. You would assume that you're one of the positives is that you're buying a proven system, that this isn't an experiment, that there's a brand recognition, just like the trademark is recognized, and manuals generally called operating manuals. There should be some insider advantages, one of which could be group buying power, that you simply can get better deals or access to things, especially nowadays with supply chain issues, that a franchise system would have better access to the products, to the services that they need to maintain their system, and a team culture of both positivity and team building, best practices sharing, and all of which leads to a road to success. There are some cons to it. One of which is success is not guaranteed in a franchise system. Believe it or not, there are McDonald's that have not only failed but have closed. And the same with virtually any other highly successful franchise system. You're going to be paying ongoing royalties and fees, sometimes that are calculated off of the performance of the business. so that the better you do, the better the franchisor does. That is a typical arrangement, but not the only way. You're required to work within whatever the structure is, and you can't move beyond it. The conformity. There's an expectation by the public when you go to a franchise business to have the same experience at each one. So sometimes that is can be an uncomfortable experience for someone who's very creative type and wants to keep throwing out new ideas, concepts, products, or services, pricing models, whatever it may be. You may be limited or not be able to do that. Even if the franchisor works closely, is very fluid with their franchisees, getting approval to change something may take quite a while. And that's a binding contract that you sign when you become a franchisee. Another thing is it's a symbiotic relationship. If franchisees don't do well, the franchisor is not going to do well. And so you really are there's a codependency. So people always ask me, so what's the best franchise? A consulting session I had with one of my SCORE clients yesterday, exactly that question was brought up. And the answer is simple. You need to find something that gives you a good opportunity to be successful, but being successful while doing things that you're comfortable doing. So here's just a quick look. There are literally tens of thousands of recognized names and some names you may not be familiar with that are franchise systems. A majority of the mattress operations you hear advertised, health, fitness centers, QSRs, the quick serve restaurants, on and on and on. So, I mentioned 7-Eleven. You can see, it's endless, and because of that, it's difficult to respond to someone when they say, "Well, what's the best franchise for me?" If you went into a restaurant and asked the waitress, what's the what do you recommend? They should be responding first, asking about you. Do you like me? What do you like? And that typically is what happens when we have a conversation about pursuing a franchise. So they talk about doing a self-assessment. What do you prefer? What are you happy doing? What are you comfortable doing? And also, do you want to have employees, or do you want to just be working with yourself or your family? The business venue, do you want to be working from your house? Do you want to be having an outside office, a store, a warehouse, trucks? What level of income are you looking for? Do you want to be interacting with the franchisor? How about the hours? Do you want to have the life of a business that's open from 6 a.m. till 2 a.m, like maybe a McDonald's might be? I'm not sure. Or do you want something that's just a Monday through Friday business? The environment. Do you want something where you might be down on your hands and knees and cleaning out rotting sewer systems? Or do you want a button-down suit franchise? what amount of risk are you willing to take? And do you want the type of a franchise that requires that success normally is attached to needing to operate more than one location, or that you can be successful with just a single. So let's take a look at a couple of franchise fallacies. A lot of people will say, I want to be a franchisee because I want to be my own boss. Well, yeah, you are to a certain extent. And people will say, well, I want that security of a franchise system. There are franchise systems that fail, and franchisees that fail within successful franchise systems. There's a belief that the FTC, we mentioned that earlier, that it closely monitors franchise systems. Not the case. It wasn't the case 35 years ago when I went to DC and visited with the FTC. They didn't have the budget, the manpower, the bandwidth to be doing deep dives unless they were seeing class action type of complaints occurring. And the FTC doesn't generally even do much of the research. You almost have to deliver them the whole argument with supporting data for them to even begin taking a look. So how do we go about finding a franchise? Sometimes it's word of mouth. You might be a customer at a place. You can reach out to franchise brokers. You can even reach out to business brokers. You can go to franchise expos, business expos. You can do searches on the internet, media. There's franchise magazines, business magazines. Sometimes newspapers have franchise articles. And here's just a couple of, everything on here is going to be appearing added to the SCORE YouTube library that'll be available to everyone after. So public libraries are a wonderful starting point for a lot of things. The research desk is terrific. Franchise brokers. I've vetted a number of franchise brokers. I'm extremely comfortable recommending people work with. You can surf and search. You can Entrepreneur Magazine, every year does their Franchise 500. The franchisors have an organization called the IFA, International Franchise Association. You can talk to other franchisors and their reps that you may meet, connect with again through any of those sources. And if you do, you'll be able to secure an FDD, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a while, and get a list of all the franchisees. So moving forward, you'll want to talk to a franchisor or many franchisors. When you do, remember, you also want to talk to the franchisees, to many franchisees within a system. You can talk to professionals. It could be attorneys. It could be business advisors. Certainly, you can meet with, whether you go to buy an existing business, whether it's a franchise or not, certainly want to be reaching out and utilizing the free services of SCORE mentors. So dig for the truth about a franchise. So we talked about the FDD. It's a franchise disclosure document, which prior used to be called the Uniform Franchise Offering Circular, UFOC. That document is required by the FTC. At minimum, it's going to be about a 185-page document, and that's before any addendums. And in some systems, that FDD could be in excess of 500 pages. It's a lot to read, but there's no way around it. You need to understand what the system requirements are, what the obligations are, what limitations are placed on you, what growth opportunities are available, what the financial implications are. We talked earlier about an initial upfront franchise fee and ongoing royalties. There can be, and it's very typical to have a dozen or more different types of fees that are assessed and ongoing. And so you can't prepare a budget and do financial projections about your potential return on investment if you bought a franchise, if you didn't initially understand the terms of the FDD. Talking to franchisees is a wonderful exercise. Again, at the back of an FDD will be a list of all current franchisees in a system, as well as recent former franchisees. Sometimes it'll list a phone number. Sometimes the contact information will be an email address. It's not always easy to contact them. It's not always easy to get good information, trustworthy information from a franchisee, and there's a good reason. If you approach an existing franchisee, let's say at a donut shop, and that franchisee is hoping to get approved to buy more locations, they want to make sure that the franchisor thinks they're a good person, they're a positive person, they're a supporter of the system. And even if that franchisee has some questions, has some disappointments they've experienced, they don't know that they can trust someone that approaches them out of the blue and asking them questions. They don't know that you may not be related to the franchisor. So don't rely on talking to 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 franchisees and feeling you have a clear picture. Talk to many. We're not going to read through all of them. You've had a chance to look at just a sampling of them. But that last question is, if you're just an average Joe franchisee, what realistically could you net? Could you make yourself, not at the top, at the bottom, during your first year? So there's different ways to go through the franchise process. You can look at different businesses. First of all, there's essentially 3 ways you can go into business. You can start your own business, you can buy an existing non-franchise business, or you can buy a franchise. So, you may want to consider more. We talked about some of the ways like at expos or magazines or to franchise brokers. When you've decided, reach out to one or many franchisors, request a brochure, and if you're interested, then go further and request an FDD. Some will send them to you. Some will make it a little more, want you to jump through a few hoops to look at that FDD. Should never ever be a charge for an FDD. If you're having difficulty getting it, certain states, it's very easy to go on other states' websites. Not as easy in Illinois, even though we have a pretty good fair franchise protection piece in place here. But some other states, it's pretty easy to pull that just from the internet. So, consider things like, will it last? Is this something that's very popular right now? Let's talk about the impact of COVID. How's COVID going to impact that type of business? Just because the financials looked good from prior to COVID, what impact has that had? If it was a health club, what impact did COVID have on that? If it was a sit-down bar and lounge operation, what impact did COVID have on that? Is it a seasonal thing? Maybe you want a seasonal thing, or maybe you don't. So the return on investment, there is no guarantee that just because you pay a lot of money, you're going to make a lot of money. And while a lot of people think that you, with a relatively small amount of money, can get into a franchise system, it's rare that you're going to be able to buy a franchise system that gives you a reliable chance of being successful if you're not writing a check for at least 6 figures, generally closer to, much further north than 100,000. It could be close to 150, could be 250, but every system has a different cost of entering the system. So let's talk about what's best for you. Do you want a location? Do you want to be working from home? If you are concerned with time, remember, if you're starting a business that requires a building getting remodeled, that's going to take time. Do you need to have a business that generates positive income right away? That's going to impact your decision. And again, we referred to how many hours a week are you comfortable? Do you have other obligations that are going to impact things? How much do you want to make? Is your family behind you on this? And how about your sales skills? Some people are much more comfortable dealing with the public and pitching their product or services than others, and that's fine. But you want to place yourself in a business where you're doing things that you're comfortable, you're happy doing. So if you, for instance, you have the junk removal, the got junk businesses. If initially the business model would expect that the franchisee is going to be out there with the rest of the crew, moving things and lifting things and sorting things, you want to make sure that you're comfortable with doing physical things. Area protection. Different franchise systems operate differently. Some will tell you, for instance, you are the Arlington Heights territory, but you have no defined, all that means is they require you to have a presence there, to have an office there. But any other franchisee of that system, whether they're in San Diego or Timbuktu, is allowed to go and market within your territory. So, find out about that. Can the franchisor, if let's say you develop, and we'll use Arlington Heights as an example, can the franchisor at any point down the road come in and open additional locations there and not even offer you an opportunity for, or put you in the uncomfortable position of having to franchise it, or else someone else with the same brand, same system, same advantages, same business model is going to be competing with you. So franchise systems differ. Many sell individual by individual territory, or area or store unit. Some will sell multiple, some sell the right to develop a territory, and some actually let you become the franchisor. So there's a quick recap of some of the things we just talked about. How quickly do you want to be up and running in business? How much money do you have available to get in business? Keep in mind, funding from the SBA and from traditional lenders is generally easier for established franchise systems than for non-franchise businesses. Think about how much you want to work, how much you enjoy the things required to make the business successful. Another thing we should talk about is, we talked about the impact of COVID. The labor market has gone topsy-turvy as a result of COVID and some other factors. It reminds me of a joke that you ask someone, so how many employees do you have working for you? And the boss says, well, about half of them actually work. So it's hard enough to even find employees. Motivating them to work to the level you want them to can be another thing. So all things to consider. Who's going to run the business? Are you leaning towards something because you think that's what your buddies, your family wants you to do? Keep in mind, they're not the ones that are going to be operating it. If you're going to be the owner operator, make sure it's something that you're going to just enjoy doing. So just like with that first date, don't get married after the first date. Franchisors, and I can tell you because I was there, when we see fresh meat, when we see someone who's interested, a prospective franchisee, like Tom, inquiring about buying a franchise, we press them, we tell them all the good things about the system, all the pros, and all the great experiences of successful franchisees. And we encourage them to come to Discovery Day. Discovery Day very often means flying at your expense to the home office to meet with the principals of the franchisor. And they want you there to complete the sale. So don't spend the money, don't commit to doing that unless you've done all of that research. You've read through the FDD, you've contacted existing and former franchisees, you've worked with your SCORE mentors and other professionals. So don't participate in Discovery Day till you've done your due diligence. And also, if your business is going to require a physical location that's going to require signing a lease, take a look. If the business isn't already up and running at one location, look at multiple locations and make sure you're going to be able to find premises that meets your expectations, meets the franchisor's expectations, and meets the budget of the business. You'll need all that information before you can develop a business plan. So let's just take a minute to think about, again, think about how much money you're comfortable investing. and other sources of funds if you're going to need to finance. Think about what things make you happy, what things you enjoy doing, and fit your personality and your particular situation. And do the research, take your time. Don't let anyone quick talk you into this. This is a once in a lifetime opportunity. And if we don't pounce on it today, I'm sorry, someone else is already in line. You want to do your research. And with that, we can take a look. There's so many opportunities out there. Think about what businesses are trending on the upswing right now. Things related to pets, to the grain of America, things related to home services, especially as more and more people are doing home offices. Make sure that what you're getting involved in is on the upswing, or it's going to be on a long-term plateau and not something that's about to hit the edge and start declining. Because you're going to make a decision that could be one of the most important decisions of your life. So anyway, Al, let's, if we can.
Bob, thank you so much. Really incredible insights. And by the way, if you do need to mentor on the issue of, is a franchise right for me, Bob Strauss is your guy. So when you fill out the SCORE form on the website, request Bob Strauss if you would like. He is our go-to person within the chapter and one of the foremost really knowledgeable franchise experts throughout the country, I believe. All right, we've got some questions coming in, and I think one of them is very interesting. It's about contracts. When you're getting into a deal, let's say you have reached the point where you have a franchise and you need to evaluate the contract. Whose contract is it? Could it be a contract that my attorney wrote as the potential franchisee, or am I locked into working with the franchisor's contract?
That's a good question. And that does come up from time to time. The reality is that franchisors will stick with their contract for a couple of reasons. And this isn't a negative. I'm putting on my franchisor hat because I totally understand it. You don't want to have different franchisees operating under different contracts, different terms, different limitations, because then as a company representative, you don't know what limitations each location has. And sometimes it actually can create challenges to providing the assistance to the franchisee. Another reason is in most states, the FDD gets registered annually in every state that a franchise system operates in. The FDD has the whole contract in it. If the contract gets changed, that requires the franchisor to do an abridged registration for that individual franchisee. So while there have been cases where franchisors will accept adjustments to their template, it's rare. And I think it's much more rare that they would even consider looking at a contract that was put together by a prospective franchisee's attorney. So I hope that answers.
It is helpful. Yeah. Kind of on a related topic, do franchisors have to renew franchise agreements? So I've invested and I've been a franchisee for 7, 8, 9 years. Can I be canceled after building up the business and have it taken away from me?
Wow, yeah, yeah. There's an assumption, and let's step back a second, and that brings up a good point. There's a starting date to all contracts and an ending date, and that's the same, that applies with franchise contracts. Some are for shorter periods of time, some may be for several years, many are often for 10, 15 years, or some period in between. A majority of them, but not all, will provide some opportunity to renew. The renewal may or may not be that form of contract that the franchisee originally signed. It generally isn't the same one. And for the same reason we were just talking, the systems mature and change and the contracts change, and the franchisor wants to have a fairly consistent contract applied to everyone. There is no obligation that the bottom line, if a franchisor wanted to deny renewal, I've seen cases where that's happened. A franchisee certainly can exercise their contractual rights and challenge it, and sometimes have been successful. There's going to generally be some terms of evaluating the performance of an individual franchisee, and that is going to be something that helps determine if a franchisor justifies renewing. Some renewals are free, some are a pre-established figure, some are whatever the then current franchise fee might be. So someone may have originally franchised for an initial franchise fee of $25,000, and by the time their 20-year contract is up, they may be renewing at $200,000, or it may be free. Every contract, every franchise system is different.
So this would go to the core issue of the importance of, if you get to the contract phase, to secure a lawyer with particular expertise in franchise.
Absolutely. The using, not that many people haven't used their lawyer who they've used for other businesses that aren't franchised, or for buying a house, or for suing someone for a slip and fall. So just for the same reason, you probably don't want to use a brain surgeon for heart surgery. It isn't saying that the brain surgeon isn't highly skilled. They are, but they're highly skilled in a subset of medicine that is different. Franchise law is its own peculiar animal, and then within that, knowing the nuances of the culture and how the contracts are implemented and applied by each franchisor is something that a franchise lawyer is going to be more familiar with.
Right, absolutely. By the way, if you'd like to submit a question, we don't identify who the question came from. It's all anonymous. So feel free to please submit a question. We've got about 5 minutes left. Bob, so I've made a contract, probably needed to know this when I signed the contract, but after a few years, it's just not working. And the the business I'm in as a franchisee is one that I'm thinking, can I go out and can I cancel this agreement? What kind of cancellation clause? And then can I reopen the business? Of course, and maybe under a different name, but are there typically non-competes where I'm really locked in for a period of years? Is because I signed this contract as a franchisee.
When you use the term non-compete, absolutely, that it would be unusual that a franchise contract didn't prevent someone from leaving that franchise system and doing a similar type of business at minimum within, let's say, 100-mile radius. Sometimes it may have a 2-year limitation, 5-year, and many of them will go further, that not just you can't, but your family members, again, and some of that will get into gray areas, who how can you signing something prevent someone else from doing something? But they're essentially trying to follow the money trail. If you in any way are putting money into it and getting benefit from it, so I can tell you as a franchisee, I was fortunate that when the franchise system didn't allow me, 40 some years ago to open additional 7-Elevens, there weren't non-compete provisions. So I was able to establish my own and continue to grow, because at the time that franchise system didn't allow you to own more than a couple of locations. Not the case anymore with 7-Eleven or with most franchise systems. Most now actually encourage people to grow to additional locations.
Got it. Well, thank you, Bob. To our viewers, you see Bob.Strauss at schoolvolunteer.org. Feel free to reach out directly to Bob. He's incredibly knowledgeable and one of my favorite guys to co-mentor with people within our chapter. And Bob, thanks so much for sharing your expertise, and to our viewers for staying with us. And we hope this has been of value. We so much appreciate your participation. And we have reached the top of the hour. So everybody have a good evening, and look for our replay on YouTube in about a week. SCORE, North Cook and Lake counties. And once again, on behalf of SCORE North Cook and Lake counties, have a good evening. Thank you.